Rowan Blizzard grew up in small rural communities and was encouraged to question the status quo in a farming setting. With very practical skills and a yearning for better practices, Rowan moved into North Queensland, Australia in the early 1990s. In his professional life, he was highly involved in the community first responses to Cyclone Larry and then Cyclone Yasi. In this time, he developed awareness around some of the impractical and remote systems that in effect rule our lives. While representing manufacturers and suppliers across the North Queensland region, Rowan started to seek out like-minded professionals to set about demonstrating and making changes for better housing outcomes. In this role, Rowan began to formulate the Innovation House framework.
My name is Rowan Blizzard and I come from a material and best practice housing background. I work for Innovation Houses in a voluntary capacity, and as you might see in the background, we have a charity, People Purpose Place, which is fundamentally helping people thrive as a human rather than getting too bogged down into the material detail. However, tonight's topic is addressing the Sustainable Development Goal number 7, so modern energy, and thinking about what is access for all of us that's sufficient for us to have a reliable, sustainable future ahead of us. Across my lifetime, there has been some development that is, as I approach my middle years, about humans and all our cleverness. So we, at the start of my time at school, we had the cathode ray screen. Some of the young ones in the audience clearly won't remember this. And the computer was connected via a telecom communication to the local university. It was the height of technology. And we played riveting games like ping pong on a very old school screen. Part of the conversation tonight is I want us to think about what is sufficient for us to thrive. And for some of us, this level of computing is all we actually need or still use today. Perish the thought, lots of us are very attached to our devices, but I'm certain that I'm certain that I've got family members who don't use much more than this level of computing power. This on its own wasn't sufficient to fly Apollo 13 to the moon, but today's technology certainly is far in advance of what was required to fly a spaceship, a manned flight to the moon back in the day. So the technology here with the virtual reality goggles is incredible, amazing, wonderful technology, no doubt. I'm not certain that we need that level of technology to watch cat videos. I'm sure there are some great cat videos out there, but perhaps we could be doing more or using less of this available level of technology. And likewise, the simple wristwatch. My father wore something very similar to this, and he was surprisingly never late. He could accurately tell the time, and in his 80s now, he still uses this technology and still works, right? So sufficient for us to thrive, for lots of us, that's completely adequate and perfect. However, some of us choose to use a much more advanced version of technology. And, many of us will wear something like this that can track sleep patterns, heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen level, all other sorts of data packets. And then my question is, if you're not an elite athlete, and if you're not using that, why are you collecting that? And in fact, we've found that the truth is this data that we're generating is becoming the commodity rather than the device itself. The same is true of our motor car. So this is a vehicle about the vintage that I was born, and they mostly got humans from point A to point B. They might have used a slightly different fuel. This one had seat belts, which was the height of technology, but it sort of did the job. And then today we've gone to something much more sophisticated. However, it weighs twice as much. It uses 100 times the technology, and we still haven't resolved whose actually driving. And it's full of distractions. If you just take a moment and pause and look at the screen in the middle of that, the modern car there, many of you might be surprised to know that screen has a ability to turn it off while you're driving. Now, it's probably very good not to be distracted while you're driving by turning that off. But if you think of your car, are you able to turn that off and disconnect from all these screens? Chances are we're not. So we have these things, we have this amazing technology, these amazing developments, this amazing resource, but have we resolved who's driving? And they're much the same with the telephone. So this telephone, you would ring and the other end would ring. And if no one was home, you didn't leave a voicemail, there's no ability to text, you came to the startling conclusion that whoever resided at the other end of this device wasn't available to communicate right now, and you'll have to try your chances later. So has anyone got a teenager in the room? So if you try the same, talk to a teenager with this new modern device, you'll find that they probably don't answer right now. You can't leave a message. They don't answer a text. And you come to the startling conclusion that they're not available to talk to you right now, and you try your luck, better luck later on. So for all of our improvement and development of technology, granted, some of us absolutely need the device on the right-hand side there, and we remote work or we do our business or social work, or, we're connected to friends across the globe. Absolutely powerful and a wonderful tool. I'm now going to reference a recent book called Goliath's Curse. It's written by a chap called Luke Kemp, and he talks about the history and future of societal collapse. Why collapse? Because the perpetual growth and achieving of bigger and more advanced things has a fairly inevitable conclusion. A startling revelation, I won't dwell too much on the book, but a startling revelation was at the start of humanity, when Homo sapiens first strolled the earth something like 300,000 years ago, we consumed energy from the Earth's system, it's a closed finite system, at the rate of about 4,000 calories a day. So that's not consumption. If you recall going to the local fast food chain, they'll tell you that human consumption might be 2,000 to 3,000 calories a day. It depends on the size of the human, the weather conditions, etc. How many saber-toothed tigers you're taking on. But as an average, 4,000 calories a day is complete consumption from the Earth's system for a human, for their clothing, for their transport, for their food, how complete extraction from the system. So the estimate for today's human consumption is something in the order of 240,000 calories a day. It's an infinitely larger tax on our system. And while I'm sure we need lots of the things that we're using on a daily basis, the consumption of energy for our roads, our vast houses, our big, heavy, technologically advanced cars and machines and equipment has a cost, a very high cost. Thinking back to materials, across the same period of time, our human cleverness has gone from coal only as the input to make steel to electric arc furnaces. And the electric arc furnace allows us to generate steel by getting the raw ingredients to a molten temperature using electricity only. So now that electricity is likely to have a fairly high degree of non-renewable input. But absolutely, we can make it a renewable source. And there are manufacturers who are moving to completely recycled inputs. So scrap steel going back into the furnace and looking for renewable energy to power these machines. So that transition is happening. And steel is one of the largest consumptions of energy in our whole planet system. Steel and concrete are the two most energy intensive materials, and necessarily they will have to use a lot less, emit a lot less carbon into the atmosphere and be much more energy friendly into the future. So the big end of town is trying and doing this work. There's a long way to go still. So if we think about the future trajectory of our energy consumption and the greater good and our thriving lifestyle, it is unreasonable for me to sit here and say, well, I judge greater good as my view of the world, which is hardly fair. I'm in a very privileged minority. I'm male. I have got an education. I'm from an English-speaking background. I've reached the age of 18, which some say means I'm an adult. So we're now talking less than 10% of the world's population. If we use that as a definition, so it's a bit unreasonable for me or my demographic to say this is what's right for someone in India. So recently we had a conversation in Australia around opening a coal mine that was going to be exported to India. Well, if there's 300,000 people in India without access to electricity, and a coal-fired power plant might enable that, which might then flow on to education, advancement of the economy, etc., who am I to argue against that? It's a tough conversation, but we have to be mindful and keep in check the mindset from where we're coming when we say, look at these topics. What we have found across our time working with housing and energy systems is that sufficient for a human to thrive, in my humble opinion, in my limited background, is actually very simple. And often we're asking Santa for things under the Christmas tree that are far in excess of sufficient. And that has a cost. So sufficient says, do I have a private space that I can lock and have my own security, my own retreat? Seems like a reasonable thing. Do I have space to be in communion with nature? So maybe I'll have kids and I'll take them out and engage in nature, plant a tree. Maybe I want some space where I can have my friends over and we can share a meal. Again, these are really simple core things that humans describe as their needs to thrive. And this bottom right is a place to be a bit silly, tell stories, sing a song. And around a campfire on a Saturday night, some of those stories might be true, but that is what is required to make a life where you can thrive. It doesn't need to be enormous. It doesn't need to be the most advanced widget. In fact, lots of that can be very low energy for the benefit of all of us. Again, when we're talking about coal-fired power stations and the cost of energy, there's been some conversation around our energy system having gold-plated and over-investing in the poles and wires of our system. Well, the truth is, we aren't having a conversation that says, do we need electricity to be available 100% of the time, just at the flick of a switch? In the case of North Queensland, for a specific example, we buy electricity in Cairns and in Townsville at the same price as we do in Brisbane, but we lose 30% of the electricity in transmission loss to North Queensland. So the actual cost of supplying Cairns and Townsville is something like $1 per kilowatt hour, yet we sell it at 30 cents a kilowatt hour because we've built this system and we don't question it. It might be worth saying, if you only need 100% of that system for 4 hours of the year, maybe we could say, let's reduce that and see if we can use less poles and wires and build a less complex system and make less demand on the planet's resources. It's a conversation we need to have. Same is true when we look at infrastructure, again, based in southeast Queensland. We build some of these wonderful things called tunnels and highways and motorways and byways. And then we choke that up with single vehicles with one person in them, trying to get from A to B at peak times. It's much like the energy network that maybe we should consider, can we demand shift? Can we carpool? Can we use public transport? Can we not make that trip? Some of these crazy ideas that would be less energy demand and allow us still to thrive. Because we have the ability to do lots of this already from home or from remotely. If you've spoken to a young person under 30, they might have given up on the whole paradigm of our grandparents and our parents who spoke about the Great Australian Dream and working a career for all of our days, because they see that the world has changed around them. They don't have that opportunity. But they might have a very light footprint. They might have very modest resources and the ability to travel, work online. Maybe they take shift working or part-time work, or the ability to still have relationships and family outside of the 9-to-5 grind. All of these opportunities allow us to shift demand on both office space, but also the infrastructure. So the poles and wires and the road network could absolutely be much better managed with some of these alternatives way of living our life. And there's still space for us to network with friends and family and share a meal and be in touch with nature. I would propose that if we did more of these options and less of the 9-to-5, there's absolutely a balance available to us that we don't have to sacrifice. It's not a either or option. I think the truth is that as all of the options that are on the table and being discussed, we can be productive. Doesn't necessarily have to be in the office. It doesn't necessarily have to be 9-to-5 hours. It doesn't necessarily have to be a traditional work trajectory. But we can absolutely find ways to have a very sufficient life and use a lot less energy. Now, at the same time, our energy is changing and our systems are changing to allow us to use lower carbon steel, lower carbon concrete, and maybe we should think about asking for less of that steel and less of that concrete for our own personal use and need. So using less and living more is the summary of my presentation today. And it sounds easy for a privileged bloke living in Australia who's got all the resources at my fingertips. But I'm absolutely convinced that our fixation with growth and more leaves a lot of us with a sense of less than and inadequacy. And this sense of less than and inadequacy, I don't have the big one like the Joneses, or I don't have the big bank account like Clive Palmer, is actually very unhealthy for us as a human. We can absolutely do the work and the purpose and deliver the skill that we have been, the innate skill that we've been born with and developed, without having to have the biggest car, the flashiest outfit. And I would propose that doing that in company with like-minded people, perhaps this Thrive network is an example of that, where we can find fellowship, find purpose, find a common goal, and thrive as individuals without having to have the biggest, the most expensive, the largest of every resource available to man. Just because it's on Amazon or Temu or under the Christmas tree, it doesn't mean that we have to have it.